who helped us put this together. There's a special reception for those members at the Red Fox room afterward. We'll know you by your little stickers. And we thank you again for your support for making this possible. And I'm not going to make a long introduction to this next individual. We all know him as a true modern-day hero, going against the tide, not afraid, fearless, and we are so grateful that he's agreed to join us, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Fortress where all of us are holding up today. Excuse my voice, which usually my voice gets better as I talk. So, I want to talk about the thing that we have in common, which is the erosion of the Constitution. I gave a speech in Berlin, I think last August, at the beginning of the pandemic, where I talked about Hermann Goering's observation at Nuremberg, where he was on trial and he was eventually executed. He said at that time, he didn't say in Nuremberg transcripts, he said it in a private conversation with a psychologist called Gustavo Gilbert, who was given access to the prisoners at Nuremberg. And that discrepancy, by the way, has been exploited by the modern propaganda juggernaut by these fact-checking organizations, which of course are funded by Bill Gates, by Facebook, by the medical cartel, by the State Department, saying that he never said these words at Nuremberg, and it's true, he didn't say them in the transcript at Nuremberg, but they were recorded by Gustavo Gilbert. And what he said is, Gilbert said to him, how did you do this to the German people? And he started explaining all their propaganda techniques, and Gilbert interrupted him and said, but that couldn't happen in a democracy because there's free choice, there's critical thinking. And he said, you can do this. Goering said, you can do this in any system. It doesn't matter whether it's a democracy or a monarchy or a communist system or a fascist system. All you need to do is invoke fear. You tell the people that are under attack that you're the only one who can save them, and that anybody who disagrees with you is a threat to the Commonwealth. And they will do anything that you tell them to do. And today, Hitler was democratically elected by the most well-educated people on the planet, the highest level of education, and some of the most tolerant people in Europe at that time. The reason there were so many Jews in Germany is because they fled. Germany was very bad to the Jews long before Hitler. Much less bad than the Eastern European countries, or Spain, or the other countries from which they fled to come to Germany. And so you had people that historically were tolerant, open-minded, questioning, and critical, and probably the one, a republic was the strongest democracy in Europe. And Hitler was elected, he did not take over. He was elected by people who he had 3% of the vote in the previous election. And then he won the majority because he was able to manipulate the use of fear. And we've seen one of the alarming parts of this pandemic for those of us who are a little conversant with the kind of medical paradigms that are being invoked right now, to understand with such clarity the manipulations that are taking place, the chicanery, the hiding of real data, the obscuring of all of these, of true facts and figures that we could use to make rational policy decisions. How the case fatality rates relate to the seasonal flu for each age group. Who is dying at what age? Who is not? Who is, what are the real death counts from COVID? CDC has admitted that 96% of the people, only 4% of the people who are characterized, who it classifies as having died from COVID, died from only COVID. At the average number of potentially fatal comorbidities in the remaining 96% is 3.8. The people who died, 96% of them had almost 4 other reasons that might have killed them. And the manipulation of the death certificates, the manipulation of the PCR tests, all of these manipulations that are all designed, the Gates-funded projection from the London and from IMH in Washington, which they used to manipulate the lockdowns, which we now see were 40 times the death rate that actually was imposed by COVID. So all of these mechanisms appear to have been deliberately manipulated to put our population in a state of fear. And what happens when you have a population in fear? You have the complete obliteration of critical thinking. And people stop asking questions, and it is a biological impulse. We retreat to the hardwired impulses that were hardwired into us during the 20,000 generations that the human race was wandering the African savanna in small tribal groups, at war, in battle, besieged all the time. And the only way to survival was to follow a strong male leader, to embrace a common orthodoxy that would provide unit cohesion, and then to practice blind obedience to the leader. And that's where we all go in times of fear, unless we have something else that says to us, I'm going to question this. I'm going to start questioning these things. And when you start doing that with the orthodoxies, now the official orthodoxies, the whole thing falls apart. But we've all seen this kind of bewildering imposition of totalitarian controls in our society, which we've never had attacks on the United States Constitution that are unprecedented in American history. Remember during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln tried to abandon habeas corpus, just one provision of the United States Constitution. The court said you can't do that. There is no emergency exemption in the United States Constitution. And there's certainly no pandemic exemption. And it's not that our framers did not know about pandemics. It was a pandemic during the Revolutionary War that brought the army of smallpox, brought the armies of New England to a standstill for 3 months. And they all knew about it. And there was another pandemic during the American Revolution of malaria. And Washington, ironically, used the bark of the chinchilla tree, which is the modern analog of the hydroxychloroquine, to end that pandemic. And so they knew about what pandemics were, but they didn't put in the United States Constitution that all of these rights will be suspended as soon as we have a pandemic. And here, James Madison said, the reason we put the First Amendment, the right to free speech in the First Amendment is because all of the other civil rights and human rights and constitutional rights are based upon it. If a government can hide what it's doing by censoring its opponents and silencing dissidents, it has license to do anything that it wants. So they got rid, they conspired with the social media and the media. We now have the emails that show Fauci corresponding with Zuckerberg, telling him what to shut down and what not to shut down. And they shut down the critics, and once they did that, once they imposed censorship, and they closed the debate off in the public square, they were able to go after all the other amendments. So they went after religious freedoms. They closed the churches in this country, every church in this country, for a year. And they kept the liquor stores open as essential businesses. There's no protection of liquor stores in the United States Constitution. There is protection of churches. They abolished religious exemptions. They got rid of jury trials. One of the first things that they did, the Seventh Amendment, right, the jury trial, Seventh Amendment says, under no conditions will Americans be denied their right to a trial by their peers in matters exceeding $25 in value. And yet they gave anybody who claims, any corporation that claims to be implementing a countermeasure is now immune from lawsuits. No matter if it's a vaccine maker, a remdesivir maker, no matter how negligent that company is, no matter how reckless their conduct, no matter how grievous your injury or death, you cannot sue them. And that, again, is novel in American history. All these companies now, and I saw it yesterday in the Theranos lawsuit, that the judge has banned unvaccinated jurors. That ultimately, we all know, is now a political implication, because you're getting rid of all the black jurors. The highest 70% of the blacks are unvaccinated. And you're getting rid of any juror who knows how to do critical thinking. Right? They got rid of the rights of association, rights of assembly, by telling us we have to social distance from each other, we can't gather in crowds. Imagine this. They got rid of property rights. They closed every business, 1 million businesses in this country, without due process and without just compensation, in direct violation of the Constitution. They got rid of due process, notice, and comment rulemaking. We know how you pass rules in this country in a democracy. Congress can pass rules. They can vote, they can deliberate as they see fit. But a regulatory agency cannot do that. And an executive cannot do that. Because the courts, and we all were frightened to death, were creating these unelected officials. We have to have some democratic control. So, and I've been suing people for 40 years, governments, the EPA, the Interior Department, all the state EPAs are doing kind of regulatory favors for industry without going through the regulated process. Here's what you have to do when you pass a regulation. You have to propose a rule. You have to publish a proposed rule. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get everybody to put on masks. You have to publish an environmental impact statement, a regulatory impact statement, an economic impact statement saying, here's the science that we use to support that rule. Here's the justification for it. Here's the people who will be hurt and the financial costs of those people and other costs. Here are the advantages and the benefits of that rule. They all have to be quantified. And then they have to give the public a chance to comment, notice a comment. The public then writes in and says, wait a minute, I run a wilderness kayaking group you're going to put out of business and destroy, and there's no reason there's no science that says that mass will, and on these outside settings, are going to help. Why don't you examine my business? Every business has a right to write in and say, well, we can do this, we can do that, we can mitigate the risk. So let's change the rule to accommodate that so it's as narrowly tailored as possible, as the law requires. None of that happened. And you have a public hearing where Tony Fauci brings in all of his science, a same mask work, none, and all of his scientists that he relied on, and he is not going to be able to find one because we will destroy them in depositions and embarrass and humiliate them. And then we get to cross-examine them, and then they cross-examine ours, and then the administrative law judge rewrites the rules according to so that they aren't arbitrary and capricious, and recommends them. And if they don't reflect the evidence, we can sue the agency. So there's all these democratic protections. All of that was waived. All of these things were imposed upon us by fiat, with no discussion, no science cited. And also all this track and trace surveillance is violating our right to not have warrantless searches and seizures. You go through the entire Bill of Rights, and with one exception, in the Second Amendment, they have all been obliterated. And the weird thing to me is I grew up in a liberal milieu where everybody I knew was saying the one thing we got to do is protect the Constitution. And have my side is ones who are advocating censorship and these kind of controls and the erosion and subversion of our traditional Bill of Rights is really, it is surreal. And we all read Kafka when we were growing up. We all read Orwell. We all watched, we all saw, we read all these Robert Heinlein, all of these stories, these parables about the imposition of totalitarianism. None of us, all of us knew what right was from wrong. And it's bizarre to me to see how people have forgotten those things. One of the things, and I'm writing this book now, about to publish this book on Anthony Fauci. And part of my journey in writing that book, it's taken me over a year of really intense research, it took me kind of on a journey to try to explain how this could have happened in America. And one of the things that I discovered during this process is that what's happening now, this lockstep imposition of totalitarian controls, not just in America, but in every one of the liberal democracies in the world, and all of the other countries in the world. China moved into Hong Kong and banned the last democratic newspaper, and everywhere in the world we see liberal democracy and constitutional rights disappearing. And it all happened at once, as if it was planned. And I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist, and it's tough to imagine how anybody could have planned this. But then I stumbled on these simulations, and many of you saw the simulation that took place in 201, Event 201. In October of 2019. So we now know that the virus began circulating around September 14th. And so this took place after the virus was already circulating in Wuhan. And the people who took part in that simulation were the deputy director of the CIA, April Haines, who's now the number one person in control of the National Security Agency under Biden. Bill Gates, of course, who financed it. people from the social media groups, people from the biggest pharmaceutical companies, Johnson & Johnson, people from global PR, corporate PR agencies, and health officials from all over the world, including Chinese CDC. And what were they simulating? They were simulating a pandemic. They weren't simulating a medical response to that pandemic. They were simulating a militarized response. How do you use that pandemic to, particularly in Event 201, to impose censorship globally? And that's what they were modeling. If you go look, particularly at episode 4, it's all about, and oddly, their preoccupation was, how do we stop people from talking about the fact that this virus may have been lab generated and released? So they're talking about that in October of 2019, and I'm not making this up. You can go to the simulation and see this. How do we shut these people up? George Gao, the head of the Chinese CDC, is saying we need to stop people from talking about that issue. But as I looked at that issue, I found that there was another one called SPARS, where they did the same thing. They're not talking about how do you quarantine the sick and care for them. Instead, they're how do you lock down the healthy, something never been done in history. How do you force people to wear masks? How do you force people to comply with social isolation? How do you bring in the military? How do you silence all dissent? And we're talking about how do you get people to take vitamin D, and how do you build their immune systems and tell them to lose weight, to exercise. 80% of the people who died were overweight, and it was probably a lot more than that because they were counting people who died from lightning strikes and car crashes. And how do you get how do you develop therapeutic drugs, off-the-shelf therapeutic drug? Most obvious thing to do, to create a communication system among the world's 11 million doctors, people who are frontline treating the disease, so that every successful treatment protocol is called in, if other people given the opportunity to repeat it, and then ways to assess which ones are working, which ones aren't, and to do really rapid placebo-controlled trials in hospitals all over the world, and to create field clinics where you're treating people who are not sick but are infected, so they never have to go to the hospital, and develop protocols so they never have to leave their homes. So you want to avoid hospitalizations. One, because that's the reason they gave for shutting down society. Two, if you can treat somebody before they leave their home, every time somebody leaves their home who's sick and going to the hospital really sick, that is a super spreader event. That person is spreading the disease to Uber drivers, to doctors, to nurses, to family members, to people on the street. You want to treat them at home. Give them the things that we know kill viral replication. Zinc and anything that enhances zinc, like hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and 100 other remedies that we now know dramatically reduce the spread of this disease. And what was our protocol? Our protocol was to do none of that. No treatment until you go to the hospital. Then your treatment are two things that are bound to kill you: ventilators and remdesivir. And Tony Fauci knew that remdesivir would kill you. He knew that because in 2019, he tried to use it for Ebola. 2019, he tried to use it for Ebola, and within 5 days of treatment, it gave lethal side effect to 54% of the people, and the Safety Monitoring Board ordered him to terminate the use of that drug. And he, through a phony, contrived, absolutely fraudulent study that he manipulated and orchestrated of that drug, made standard of care. It is homicide. And if you look, how does it kill people? 2 ways, 3 ways. Kidney failure, heart failure, and all organ collapse. And what happened to the people who died in the pandemic? What were they dying of? Kidney failure. All the doctors said, you heard it again and again, we've never seen a virus that attacks the kidneys. Because it wasn't the virus. It was the remdesivir. And he denied them deliberately, purposely, access to the things that we know work because 248 studies show they do, which is ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and all the other, even monoclonal steroid antibodies, which they know work. They denied all the people who were in the nursing home where they could have given it to them. So, something about this smell, it was suspicious and weird from the beginning, but what I found during the course of my research is that those simulations were not just confined to event 201 into SARS. I found now over a dozen of them where they did them at least once every 2 years from beginning in 2000. Most of them were top secret, but they involved hundreds of thousands of people. They were doing these simulations with all the police forces, many of the big city police forces in our country, with frontline doctors and nurses, with medical officials, with the big corporate officials from the energy industry, from the medical cartels, from the pharmaceutical industry. And they were involving not just the United States, Canada, Mexico, and all the nations of Europe were all participating secretly and drilling this again and again and again.
Affecting their lie.
If you look at the techniques that they were using, I've spent a lot, here's some things they have in common. Virtually every one of those simulations involved representatives from the CIA, and they were written, the scripts for them were written by people associated with the intelligence agencies. Almost all of them had a well-known American or European leader. The heads of Denmark, Sweden, Sam Nunn, Madeleine Albright, Gary Hart would be at the head of them. And that gave them kind of an imprimatur of gravitas and legitimacy. So all of these frontline workers who are being asked to do weird things, not cure patients, but censor people, they all now have in their head, this is what you do with the pandemic. This is a legitimate way to respond to the pandemic. This is the only way to respond. It's not to make people better. It's not to treat their illnesses. It's not to keep them alive. It's to clamp down totalitarian control. I wrote a book about my family's 60-year battle with the CIA called American Values. And in researching that, I went out and purchased, at great cost, some of them cost me thousands of dollars, the CIA manuals for manipulating large populations. And they wrote a series of manuals for the techniques that are useful when the intelligence agencies want to go into other foreign policy pangerms, want to go into an indigenous society to destroy local businesses, to isolate, to destroy institutional structures, to destroy social structures and social relationships, to obliterate the economy, to create chaos, that will then create enough people in that country who will allow a foreign entity to come in and clamp down centralized control. And almost all of the techniques that are outlined in those manuals are the same techniques that they were practicing in these simulations year after year after year with hundreds of thousands of people. And for example, in the CIA manual, the CIA conducted these well-known programs that were called various names, Operation Artichoke, MK Ultra, etc., during the late 50s, 60s, and 70s. And to develop ways of manipulating human beings on an individual basis and on a mass basis. And the most potent technique, incidentally, that they learned again and again and again, more potent than physical torture, was isolation. If you can isolate people, and they did this with sensory deprivation, tanks, also just locking people in solitary confinement, you can get them to do almost anything you want after a certain period of time. It will drive them mad, because we're social animals, we're social beings. And when you tear those social fabric, it makes people desperate, fearful, and obedient to do anything. Another technique is called Stockholm Syndrome, which is a way of putting individuals or large parts of humanity on lockdown for long periods of time. And it induces a kind of mass psychosis that makes them grateful to their captors, makes them empathize with their captors, renders them obedient, believing that obedience is the only path to salvation, absolute obedience. And it obliterates again critical thinking. But during this period, the CIA was funding these kind of studies at many 149 universities, including McGill University in Canada, universities at Berkeley, Harvard, Columbia, many others all around our country, and even some universities in Central America, Guatemala, etc. And they were using prison populations, they were using military people, they were using the subjects from mental institutions, people who were expendable, whose disappearance would not be noticed. And one of the, we don't know exactly which of these projects were funded by the CIA, because that was never released in the family jewels disclosures in the 1970s when the Senate did these investigations. All the material was subsequently destroyed, or most of it. But there were these mind control experiments at all the colleges, and one of the ones that almost certainly was funded by the CIA, scholars believe, is an experiment called the Milgram experiment. Many of you have heard of it. The Milgram experiment, and you can look this up, was a young psychologist or social scientist called Stanley Milgram, and he recruited subjects from every walk of life, blacks, whites, cross-section American, factory workers, construction workers, university professors, students, etc., housewives, and he would put the subject in a room and sit them at a table where they would twist a dial, and the dial would supposedly administer electric shocks to a person sitting in the next room who they could not see. They could hear the screams and the pleading and the crying, the agony that they were causing and the begging. And they had a guy who was dressed as a doctor in a white lab coat who was telling them, turn it up higher at different intervals. And many of the people who were turning it up were crying because they didn't want to do it, because it clashed with their essential values. It clashed with their conscience. They had to overwrite their conscience. And the doctor would have ordered them to do 67%. You can look this up, even Wikipedia, which is just a farm on propaganda site, will tell you this. That 67% of the people, of the Americans, who liberal, conservative, etc., who were told to do that, turned that dial up to 450 volts, it said on the dial, potentially fatal. So they were willing to kill somebody if a doctor told them to do it. And that's a really important lesson for today. Because what do they have? They don't have science. They don't have any success story. Fauci gave us one of the worst record, arguably, in the world at preserving life. We have 5% of the population of the world and 25% of the deaths in the richest country in the world. How's that possible? We have 1 in 1,600 per million die in our country. There's African countries where they take hydroxychloroquine once a week where they had 1 in a million die. Oh, 1,000 times greater than these poor countries that at first they were telling us they're going to bear the brunt. They're the people who are going to need the most help, and they don't want our help because they're doing it right. And so we have a doctor with the worst track record, a doctor who came in 1984 or 68 when 6% of the American public had chronic disease, which he's supposed to prevent, allergic immune diseases, autoimmune disease, which he's supposed to prevent. And today, under his watch, 54% of our children have those diseases. He has failed upward his entire career. These fiats, here's what you've got to do. He has a schoolboy's allergy to citation. He never tells us, here's the science that says this. He just says, this is what the science says. And one day the science says, masks don't work, and 2 months later it says, strap on 2 of them. There's no science cited. Lockdowns work, no science. And then all of my colleagues in the Democratic Party are saying, well, we got to trust the experts. But that, trusting the experts is a function of religion, not science. Science is about skepticism. It's about questioning. It's about cynicism. It's about not believing anything you told me. It's about show me the evidence. I was on the trial team that tried the Monsanto case. And in the Monsanto case, Monsanto came in with the greatest experts in America, people from the Harvard School of Public Health, etc. My wife, who's not an attorney, came and sat in on the trial one day when Monsanto had its experts. At the end of the day, she said, why are you even doing this? This poor company, why are you abusing them? To me. And I said to her, wait till tomorrow when we cross-examine them. At the end of that day, she said, what a bunch of liars. So every case, every law, I've been involved in 500 lawsuits, and every one of them involves, the defendants, the corporations come in with their experts, and we come in with ours. And in this case, we had Harvard experts too. And in the end, the jury believed our experts, and they gave us $2.2 billion. And so this idea that you trust the experts, it's an oxymoron. There's no such thing. Every major medical theory, whether it's heliocentrism or evolution, it started out as a minority position that was ridiculed and gaslighted and laughed at and marginalized, and then it was accepted as fact. And so, we need to respect each other's opinions. We need to respect critical thinking, and we need to be nurturing that, not silencing it. And yet we have, these political, listen, when you go to your doctor and he tells you, you got a big problem, and I need to do surgery on you, what do? You say, I want a second opinion. And we should be doing the same thing with Tony Fauci. By the way, there are many medical experts out there who are saying the opposite. There's Peter Corey, Peter McCulloch, and Peter Bregman, and Dr. Harvey Risch from Yale, and I can go on, Ryan Cole, all of these people who actually treat COVID patients and save their lives and are achieving results with those patients that Tony Fauci never dreamed of. We could have, and they're all saying 80% of Americans who died did not need to die. if you had done these common sense proven protocols. And that's what they're saying. And what is the response? It's not debate. It's not, let me see your evidence. It's, these people are dangerous, they need to be silenced. And that's not America. And you know, what all of us need to understand is that our country is under attack right now. We have lost. You know, America is, what is our country? Is it just a place where, you know, you can come and accumulate a big pile for yourself and whoever dies with most enough wins? Or is it, you know, is it the landscapes, is it the Purple Mountains majesty, is it the population, the diversity, etc.? It's all those things. More than anything else, it's our Constitution. It's the statement of shared values that holds us all together as a people. And we're saying to the rest of the world, we believe something in our country more strongly than anybody else believes, which is that we have to love our liberties more than we fear a disease.
Yeah.
When I tell my children, you know, who sometimes question me, I've said to them, because they hear CNN all the time and they read the New York Times, and you know, they say, well, this is going to kill people, and I say to them, there's a lot worse things that die, and that may seem cold, but there was a generation of Americans in 1776 who said, you know what? It's worth dying to give my children and their children a bundle of rights that will guarantee them liberty forever. And so they laid down their property, their livelihoods, their lives to provide us with that Constitution, which we have given away for free to a blind doctor in 1 year after 200 years of preserving it. And, you know, we need to understand that these are things that we need to be fighting for right now. And that, you know, I've told people for many, many years, people have come to me, famous actors and athletes, and said, you know, I don't want to challenge the vaccine protocol because it's going to destroy my career in doctors. And I've always said to them, well, there's ways to work around it, to be part of the battle, without sacrificing your livelihoods. But the time has come now where we all have to stand up. Yep. And we all have to be committing civil disobedience every single day, peacefully. And if that means when you see somebody with a baby walking by you tell them, don't give a COVID vaccine to that baby, because that baby has no chance of dying of COVID. And they have a big chance of getting injured from that vaccine. And we provide cards that talk about the facts, you know, a CHD, and you can get those, you can hang them out, you can put them in restrooms, you can put them on bulletin boards. You can tell your doctor to his face, show me the evidence. You can be confrontational with people. You can be gentle, you can say what you mean without saying it mean. You need to start talking back, and you need to start talking up. And the more people that do that, you know what? There's a lot of converts coming over to our side. There's no converts coming over to their side. And the way that they have robbed people of critical thinking is by repeating the same message over and over and over again. And we know that you know, there's peer-reviewed evidence that shows that that works, and advertising works. That's why it's a $100 billion industry. If you repeat a message, no matter how ridiculous it is, again and again, people begin to believe it. The way that you shatter that paradigm out of orthodoxy is by repeating the opposite message, the truth, and letting somebody hear that when they're out on their morning walk. They're walking their baby in a stroller through the grocery store, when they, when they're in the doctor's office, listening to the doctor fire you while you talk back to him, and, making trouble everywhere you go. And standing up, and because people are going to hear you, and they may not convert at that point, they hear that 2 or 3 times, and they're going to say, maybe I ought to look into this. And you know what happens when you start looking into this? It's down the rabbit hole, and you're like, holy crap, I can't believe what they did to us. So, anyway, I want to, again, thank all of you. We are fighting now this is the American Revolution all over again. It started out with a small group of people, and it wasn't just a revolution where people gave their lives for this country. In the Civil War, 669,000 people died to preserve our nation, and they gave up their lives with great bravery, and we need to now be willing to give up something, to make sacrifices, and to win this battle against these elites and these globalists who are trying to take away everything that is meaningful to us, our freedom, our pride in our country. And, I can say to you, I'm very proud to be in this room with all of you. What the Milgram experiment showed, at 67% of the people in this country, your neighbors, good Americans, will allow their conscience to be overridden, will trample their own values if they're told to do so by a voice of authority, and particularly by a doctor and a medical code. And the people, that's 67%. That means 33% didn't do that. And the 33% that didn't are the people sitting in this room. You need to be proud of the fact that you were not in that group that electrocuted somebody. My father told me when I was a little kid, he read the diary of Anne Frank to me and my siblings, and he said people kept saying, at that point in history, a lot of people were talking about the Nazis and how the German people, this could happen to them. My father said, this is not anything to do with Germans. We all have this disease. They can do this to any of us. And he said, you kids need to ask yourself, if this ever happened in the United States, would you be the people who hit Anne Frank, or would you be the people who turned her in? And you guys all answered that question. You're the ones who would have hidden Anne Frank, and you need to be proud of that. You kept your values, your critical thinking when they were under terrible, ferocious assault. And what I will pledge to you is that I am proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with all of you and with my friend Ron Paul and fight this battle, the Second American Revolution. And I can tell you right now, I do not know whether we're going to win or lose, and I can't tell you. The only thing I can control is a little piece of real estate inside my own shoes. And I can tell you that whatever happens, that I will go down fighting and I will die with my boots on.